Christmas, Happy New Year. I look forward to a year full of being creative with you in 2025. So this week it's just going to be a simple one, but it is important for beginning your watercolour journey, and it's going to be rocks. Now, they're not that exciting, but they can be. They're not everyone's cup of tea, but just bear with me because rocks are a really good example of perceived texture in watercolour painting, in any painting. So what we're doing is we're still painting on a nice surface, but we're tricking the eye and the brain into feeling that that is very textured. It might be craggy, rough rocks, or it might be wet, shiny rocks. So I'm going to do one of each. That one, I think the pebbles, we will bring into next week and put some surrounding water around the pebbles. So I hope you enjoy it. Please leave a comment, even if it's just a little emoji. It really helps my channel to grow and be seen, so I can get out to more people who want to learn watercolour. Thank you. Hope you enjoy the lesson. Happy New Year. Bye.
Today we're going to need some clean water. I'm using different brownish colours, which I'll go through with you. I've already drawn some pebbles up here, some stacked, very gently shaped pebbles. And now I'll go through the colours with you because first of all we're going to make these texturally smooth. I've used my Derwent brown here and my red oxide from my Derwent set, but it just is a matter of you finding 3 or 4 different shades of brown, so yellowish browns through to bluey browns, and adding either just water to them or adding either a purple or my go-to ultramarine blue. For this actual exercise, we don't need to worry specifically about the colour of the rocks. Just use whatever browns or yellow ochres are handy to you. I'm mixing up just a few different ones here, adding a bit of red oxide into one. One's golden and one's a darker, bluer brown. Now it's time to add the colour, and I'm going to start with wetting the area except for where I want to highlight on the rock. So I've really wet my brush and I'm just following around the outside of the shape of the pebble, and I'm leaving a particular little area where I don't want the paper wet, and this is going to be my highlight. So I'll continue to do this on the next pebble. I think I may have used a bit too much water on the first little pebble, but that's okay. We'll see how we go. Now I'm going to add some light colour, mix it in, my lightest brown with my yellow ochre, a little bit of sepia or burnt sienna, and adding that into the water. Yes, it's very runny, but that's okay. I still haven't got any colour that's going to run into my highlight area because I've left that paper dry. So remember that whether you're using wet on wet, which will give you a softer edge, or like I have here, wet on to dry, because I wanted that harder edged highlight shape. I'm just adding a bit of depth here to this one. But remember, when you have shiny objects or wet objects, they're more severe in their graduation from highlight to light tones to their darkest tones. If you go back to my video, I might pop it up here, of the shiny metal spheres. That shows you exactly the same thing that's happening here, and that is that severity and contrast between your lightest lights and your darkest darks. I'm continuing to leave the same white paper highlight for each pebble. Now for some colour, and as I apply quite a strong burnt sienna here, I'm just going to start around the base because I know that's where it's going to be darkest, and then gently build it up around the outside areas of the pebble. Not just outlining it, but I want to come back in after I've put this darker colour down and just soften off the edge a little bit so it's not a really, really harsh line. just be aware that when you put your paint down, the most important thing is to leave that highlight. If you have not been able to leave a highlight, it won't be as effective, it won't look as shiny, but you can come back over it and try and lift that colour out of the paper, or you can add in some white gouache. Add a little bit of phthalo blue to your white gouache to actually make it a bluish colour. Now, if you're wondering why I've left one pebble empty, it's just to keep it easier to work with, because the gap in between the two pebbles that I'm adding colour to should remain dry, so I'll do that one last. Remember, when you're painting 3 or 4 things of the same nature, it is interesting to have them as different tones, not just different colours. So that means some pebbles you may want to keep quite light in comparison to the darkness of the other browns. Now, I'm using some clean water now because I'm actually going to add a little tiny bit of phthalo blue. Remember, that's the silent P. And I'm going to use just a smidge of it watered down, and that's going to add onto my paper to give me the lightest bluish tinge in my highlight on the pebbles. And I did mention earlier, if you had to go over it with white gouache, to add a little bit of this blue. It does give you the influence of a little bit of sky blue reflected in the highlights. Okay, now it's time to get some darks in here and increase the tonal contrast of this whole area. Remember, our lights only look light when our darks surround them. So I'm using my ultramarine blue and my dark brown to actually get a really nice, deep, strong colour. And that's going to go in between the joins of every pebble. So the base of each pebble is going to be strengthened and then form a little bit of shadow onto the lower pebble. If we don't get game enough, I guess, brave enough with our darks, we won't get the impact of that tonal contrast. So sometimes when we're painting, especially when you're a beginner, you tend to not go as heavy, and it's a little bit of being unsure, it's a little bit of not wanting to, your brain wants to keep you safe and not want to do too dark an area. But when you have something that's wet and shiny, just remember that the tonal contrast, so the variation from your lightest lights to your darkest darks, is what actually is really powerful in creating the perceived texture of what you're painting. And that is something that's smooth, reflective and shiny. So be really brave when it comes to your darks, and remember with watercolour that the joy of watercolour as opposed to acrylic and oils is that it's so easy to lighten an area if you have put it too big of an area of the dark, or even perhaps if it's too severe, just wet the edges and rub it a little bit and soften it. As a beginner, one thing that you can overlook the importance of is working your darks into your midtones but softening them. So quite often when you add your darks, your paper may not be as damp as you need it to be, or you might not have enough moisture on your brush. It's just little subtle things that you have to look out for. And the one thing that I think as a beginner is that you don't know any better. So when you do it and it doesn't look quite right, quite often it'll stop you from pushing yourself again and trying that little bit more. Now on to our rough rock, which I'm going to just draw up with a pastel pencil, which is like a brownish, greenish brownish colour. And I don't have any reference for this, but what I'm going to do is just be really rough and rugged in my line. I'm just going to repeat the same sort of shapes. They can be individual rocks, they can be part of a rock face, doesn't really matter. The important thing with this is getting that texture. So I do want to have crevices, I want to have deep cracks in the rock and indicate that it's a very rough surface. So very strongly that perceived texture of being rough and dry and craggy. Now, unlike this colour palette, I'm just going to use something a little bit lighter and all quite similar. So this is my yellow ochre here. You could use a raw oxide, raw sienna, and I'm going to add a little bit of French ultramarine to it to deepen it, but also to desaturate it. Remember, orange and blue are opposites, yellow and purple are opposites. So yellow ochre plus French ultramarine blue is going to be a little bit greenish. And if it's too green, what's opposite of green on the colour wheel? Well, it's magenta. So I've got red or magenta over here. If I add a little bit of magenta to this colour, it's going to desaturate the green because it's opposite. So when I add a tiny bit of magenta, I can test it out. If it's still a bit too greenish, a little bit more magenta, and you can see then that it starts to be more brown, which is exactly what we're looking for. Now, I have a wet brush here, but the paper is dry. I really don't care too much about being nice and neat and even with this, but I'm laying my brush down really quite flat. So remember, sandshoe technique, not stiletto, and really just pushing colour around on the paper. I'm really heavily pushing the base of where the bristles meet the metal section here. I'm really pressing that down and sort of swirling and putting force on it, very flat and pressing, and then I'm pushing the brush up like a stiletto. So from a sandshoe to a stiletto. And if it helps you, you can rotate the brush a little bit in your fingers, but I just choose to sort of swirl that around with a bit of pressure. If your paint is too runny, you won't see any craggy, sort of crazed paint marks on the paper. So look for that. If you've got too much moisture in your brush, it'll stay a bit too smooth. So here you can see my mix is not too runny, and I'm definitely not adding lots of water. But I would suggest try a drier brush to begin with, and then if it's not working at all and you're barely getting any paint on the paper, just tip the very end of your bristles into the water jar, not the whole bristles. You may even get a little droplet of water on your finger and just tip your brush into that. So minimal water, and remember, you can keep adding colour but keep the mix a little bit dry as well. I'm just repeating this mix before, and remember to add the magenta if your brown looks too greenish. And I'm adding a little bit of weight, a little bit of darker line here and there. The order of light to dark I don't really care about. My primary thought is to create this rough, rugged texture. So I allow myself to be in the flow, and when I feel I want to go dark, I'm just going to push that brush around, push those bristles around and make it darker, and then if I want it to be light, I'll make it lighter. I think for this technique, the main tip I can give you is to start with a shape that you're happy with your rock shape, and then have some indication of where your light is coming from. So for me, I look at the edges here and I want them to be dark because that's the base of that rock, and the beginning of the next little section of rock below it is going to be light, and that's giving me depth. Light on top, then it comes down to dark, and then the next little bit of the rock is going to be light on top and then going down to dark once more. And as I said earlier, whether that's one big rock or a whole separate lot of rocks, it doesn't matter. You are able to, create that texture. Now, with this one, as you can see, I'm putting a little bit of water, not too much, but a little bit of water down first. This is just to show you the variation of it. If you want to work more with water, if you have problems with your spreading of colour with it being too dry, this is an option. Remember the rule that when you wet the paper, your markings will generally be softer. Now, soft is not exactly what you think of when you think of rough textured rock, but looking at what I'm going to do here, you can see that it will soften off as it dries, and then what you do is you go over that soft area with more sharp edged marks of darker colour. So here I can go in quite dark if I want to. Around this whole area I could put some really heavy dark lines in, or I could choose to wet it over the top of the dried paint that's there and blend in some different spots of colour, some darker tones, some little dark marks just sitting there on top. So for me, craggy, rough textured rock always starts off with drier paint. It's quite different to the way I did the pebbles. So think dry paint and think flat bristles onto the paper. That's your priority. Once you get going on it though, you can create that effect by using a little bit more water on the paper. Just remember that you need layering of drier, heavier, harder edged paint colour to create that rough texture look. Now, things you can do as a whole to have an effect on the overall rock shape is flicking with your brush. So I don't do this very often, and when I do, I usually take time to mask an area out so that I don't get random flicks of paint on my paper, which I've done here. So quickly, the best thing to do is as soon as that happens, you wet and you dab those marks away. But if you have Frisk film, if you've heard of Frisk film, that's a good way to actually cover over what you need to protect, and then you use a very sharp scalpel blade to cut around the profile of what you're wanting to protect and what you're wanting to actually flick on. I find it's just a little bit hit and miss, and I actually like the chill out of just making individual little blobs. So sometimes you can generally use a little bit of paper or card to protect your area. Look, really it's up to you, but when I go really dark now with my browns, like I'm mixing up here, I just like the little individual dark crevicey marks and cracks and spots and little flicks of paint rather than doing it in one big foul swoop. I guess that comes down to whether you are a controlled person, like a controlled painter, or like things to be really loose. If you look back at my previous video, which I'll put here, if you're not sure whether you're a controlled painter or a really free painter, this video will help you with that, figure that out. Okay, so overall when I'm painting rock, I like to do what I've done so far and build up some depth and build up the texture. But at the end, or towards the end of anything I'm painting, if it's a 3D object, I need to combine or link everything together with shadow. So when I'm painting something individually, I always leave to the end and think, okay, how can I unify this? And it's usually with shadow, linked shadow or shade. And so what I would do, if you've got no reference to go by, create a point of sunlight. So mine is on the top and slightly to the left. So that means that when I'm painting, the sun's going to hit those areas top and to the left, and the shade is going to be on the right hand side and the underside of each section, like I'm painting now. And then any shadow that's cast is going to be reflective of that sunlight direction. If you don't have that unity, your rocks are going to lose believability, because the brain, even though you may not be aware of it, our brains are very aware and automatically aware of things like consistency in the angle of sun and shadow on objects. So you can see here I've indicated where my sunlight's coming from, so my shade area as well is going to be consistent. Now, as I said earlier, I'm adding a unifying shade here, shade colour, shadow colour. As long as it's cooler and darker than the actual rock colour and runs across all of the rocks, it's going to link them all together and increase that depth of the rock and enhance the shade feeling of that entire side of the rock. And I think I will leave it there. It's up to you how dark you take it. I was making a lighter rock, but obviously you could go much darker than this. And now I'm just going to play with adding some background in here. This isn't what I was talking about when I said I'll add some water around the rocks for next week. It's the other ones, the pebbles. But this one I just wanted to show you the impact of the highlight side of the rock, the top part of the rock. When you get a background on there, that's what punches it forward. So sometimes when you paint an object, give yourself a break if you just painted an object and you don't have a background in there, because as a beginner, I remember having to paint things that I thought were incredibly boring, like stainless steel scissors, and we weren't, you know, at college we weren't doing any background as such, it was just the scissors. And I just remember thinking, oh, it's so boring, I'm just using grey, you know, and it wasn't my thing because I loved colour so much. But the impact is there. If you don't have a strength in your subject, adding a strong background in will actually take over it. So that's why I leave my backgrounds, and something like this I wouldn't put them in till the end anyway, because you want the subject to be the rock in this case, and the texture of the rock to be noticed. So then when I'm happy with that, I'll wet the paper around and I might put in some sky and some ocean like I'm doing here. So I know it's hard to figure out the order of things. As a beginner, it's something you find your way with, and that's what I'm here to help you with. So I hope I have helped, and I hope that you can join me again next week when we will put some lovely water background behind our pebbles. Have a lovely week. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye.